welcome to the Cyber Headspace podcast. Today we'll be discussing all things DeepSeek. I'm here with Anthony Lloyd, our principal technologist at TMC3. I'm Andy Pyne, head of growth and client success. And this morning I just want to chat through with you, Anthony, a few things about DeepSeek. In essence, I've heard a lot about it over the last few days. I've read a lot about it. There's huge amounts of noise, and Nvidia had huge amounts of their value wiped off them because of it, supposedly. What's all the fuss about? Why should we care? In a nutshell, who cares?
I love how you say Nvidia, by the way. Nvidia. So the thing that makes DeepSeek quite interesting is, publicly at least, they have managed to create a model that is much more efficient. So China, from a few years back, were basically banned from buying the latest NVIDIA chipset graphics cards, which means that their ability to create these models was quite limited. Because fundamentally, AI, especially LLMs, are only as good as their models. And the reason that OpenAI and the likes of that spend so much money is because the cost to make these things is directly proportionate to the amount of GPUs or otherwise specialist chips that are needed for it. The difference with DeepSeek is that they claim, and there is some dispute about this, but the official claim from DeepSeek is they managed to do it with older, less powerful GPUs because they were allowed to purchase those. Now, there is some stories that suggest that they have, through the back door, almost managed to get hold of some of these newer NVIDIA chips through other countries that were kind of reselling, etc. But that's probably not the point of this discussion. But fundamentally, yeah, the thing that makes DeepSeek quite exciting is the cost to make those models are therefore much cheaper, and update those models, and therefore the cost that they can then charge it back to the consumer at. And we'll talk about what consumer actually is in a minute, because I think that's quite an important part. But the cost to the consumer is significantly less because the cost to make them is significantly less. So fundamentally, DeepSeek isn't doing anything above and beyond what existing technologies like OpenAI have achieved, but it's the fact they've done it a damn sight cheaper, and therefore they can sell it a lot cheaper. And potentially, there's a whole argument to be made that AI development is going to be slowed down by technical limitations such as the availability of these expensive chips. And if you can do twice as much processing with the same amount of hardware, even if you have got access to the latest NVIDIA chips, you should be able to speed up development of future model growth. Right. So either you save money or you go quicker, but either way, it's going to be quicker / cheaper than what the current technologies are. That's fundamentally why everyone's getting excited by DeepSeek, in my opinion.
I was going to say, so that all sounds like quite a positive message overall, really. We're looking at the acceleration of potentially AI development. We're looking at lower costs to the consumer. Those all sound like good things. So why is this created beyond that so much noise? What is there? There must be a downside.
Within Europe, obviously, we have a common data protection framework, GDPR in the case of that. In the UK, we've got Data Protection Act. And fundamentally, what that says is that you can pass citizen data or data subject data, if you want to be specific, to these countries, no problem. Now, the US has always been a bit of a weird one, and I could probably spend hours talking about that, but effectively there is a sort of agreement that, but effectively safe harbor. There was actually Privacy Shield, Safe Harbor. They're kind of very similar, but there is an acceptance that in the US they can process personal data for European citizens, and therefore everyone's been in harmony for this amount of time. So AI, a lot of these. So, for example, if you type into ChatGPT, it's probably going to be a US data center. They do have some EU data centers, I believe, and certainly when you look at things like OpenAI in Microsoft Azure, you can have it in EU data centers. So at the moment, everything has always been EU, US. The thing that makes DeepSeek more interesting is because DeepSeek is owned by a Chinese hedge fund. And I think China, I'm not sort of trying to get into geopolitical conversations at this point, but China has quite strict rules about the level of control they have on organizations that are headquartered in China. So fundamentally, there's an extra concern. So DeepSeek as a company may well have the ability to be influenced by the Chinese state, which is problem number one, and the difference number one, because the US generally don't know. The US is not going to interfere in AI model tuning, is the official story. Whereas China, there is quite a strong expectation that the Chinese state will interfere. The second piece is about data residency. So I mentioned data centers earlier.
Yeah.
Ultimately, now it's a bit slightly complicated, and I'll come on to that in a sec, but basically there's a strong suspicion that the majority of this data will be processed in Chinese data centers, and therefore that data is available. And when I say data, I mean user data, so in other words, who you are. So when you log in to the system, obviously it knows who you are, but also what you actually feed it. So if you're uploading files, if you're talking to it, it's going to have all of that information in China, and therefore data residency rules apply to China. Now, GDPR does not allow data to be processed in China at the moment, so there's a whole commercial concern and kind of question marks around that. But fundamentally, I think the problem is split down to you've got the legislative issues like GDPR, Data Protection Act, which say data is processed in China, but we've also got the concerns that will the Chinese state interfere with the data that ultimately either goes in or potentially gives back. So we've obviously got concerns already about filtering, etc. And we're not just an AI problem, actually, it's more of a social media thing. You know, if you look at how Twitter, or X as it's now called, obviously, how Elon Musk makes a whole spiel about free speech, we're potentially going to start to see issues of AI where the responses are also being changed.
Understood. Yeah. So because you can't necessarily guarantee, what's going into the AI at source either, as well as the contributions into it. I think so. On really interesting point there. So for us, most of our customers, we're a public sector business. What are the connotations here potentially for public sector entities with the emergence of the DeepSeek AI? What do you foresee some of the problems could be?
So I think public sector specifically, we've probably got two unique problems. So if we look back at TikTok as another example of a Chinese company that has very strong links to the Chinese state, UK government were quite quick, in fairness, to ban its use for any sort of government type business. I think, for example, they don't allow it on government devices, so phones or laptops. I think they block a lot of the traffic to it. So potentially we have a similar issue there. So the government may simply ban government use of the service, which, to be honest, it could be interesting because that might be good, it might be bad. Ultimately, I think we need to understand the risk. But I do think most government departments will probably be forced, from someone like NCSC, will ultimately create, I imagine, some sort of directive that has to be banned. If, for example, though, they don't, for whatever reason, or maybe they change the conditions to say you can only use it for a certain number of things, the second concern, specifically, I won't say it's just for public sector, but it's definitely more impactful in public sector, is that staff ultimately there's always a risk that they're going to give it more information than they intend to, potentially. So they could be uploading documents to it, for example. So the concern is that the state of China, the nation state that is China, should and could be able to get some of that data and make use of it. So if, for example, we look at classifications, you're not going to, I really hope you're not going to end up having a civil servant uploading secret or top secret material to any form of AI, to be honest. But potentially something like official sensitive type data or classified data could end up being uploaded to a service which could then be used for potential harm.
Absolutely. And then we'd be looking at a problem like the aggregation of data then becomes a problem. So too many official sensitive elements then combined together can become secret, and too many secret can become top secret. So I think that's a really interesting point. So what you're hinting at there, Anthony, is that actually some of the biggest problems here could be human related problems. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you ask me as an individual or as an employee of a company, would I be concerned about using DeepSeek to ask it for a recipe on how to make a cake? Then the reality is no, because the use is of very limited nature. The problem we have, and this isn't just a public sector problem, actually, it's wider than that, but anything you upload to it, you don't exactly know how it's going to be used. So yeah, humans, it may start off, I'm just going to upload a document that's got a bunch of unique reference numbers. They're not necessarily sensitive, they're nothing particularly fancy, because all you want to do is just ask it to generate you a different type of list, or you want to get it to combine something or whatever. It doesn't seem that difficult. And you mentioned obviously data aggregation there, Andy. That's exactly the point. you can either use data combined to become an issue, or potentially you can use it to steal something directly. And I do think that the human doesn't necessarily, or a human is going to necessarily think about, they'll think about the obvious stuff. If there's something in there that's got a load of personal data, the chances are they won't upload it. They're probably not. There might be accidents, of course, that does happen, but it's probably less of a concern. But it's more likely the smaller subsets of those data that get uploaded, because they started off by asking it to do a very simple task, and then it ended up, they asked it to do 10 simple tasks, and actually those 10 simple tasks individually have combined to create a larger data set. So yeah, absolutely, it is a human issue though, just to be clear. I do agree with what you're saying there. Absolutely does feel like that's the biggest risk, because the technology itself is not that fundamentally different to any other technology. If I upload a document to Pastebin, for example, or forget AI, if I upload a document somewhere, it's still the same principle. It's still available. In fact, ironically, there was an article in the news very recently about DeepSeek where they had misconfigured their own. I think they managed to expose a database from memory, which I think just highlights the point. Humans make mistakes, even if they are working for what is probably going to become one of the biggest companies in modern times very soon. I have no doubt about that. So yeah, it's interesting, and that again highlights another problem. We don't necessarily. So in cybersecurity, we rely on trust. So we can achieve that via due diligence, or we can achieve that via, questioning or reviewing external reports, etc. But fundamentally, are we confident in organizations' ability to keep the data that we pass it safe? And this applies to anybody, whether it is, what's it called? DeepSeek, whether it is DeepSeek, or whether it's Microsoft, or whether it's OpenAI, whether it's Meta, whatever. We all have to rely that the data we're uploading is going to be kept, because all of the security controls they talk about, and if I just bounce back to OpenAI for a second, on Microsoft, even with Copilot, they talk about. Why is it? Sorry, I just made me laugh. As I said Copilot, it popped up 10 minutes later. Ask Copilot for notes and actions.
Always listening, Anthony. That's why. Always listening.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so with services such as Copilot, ultimately we're assuming that Microsoft are going to treat that data in the way that they said they will. So Microsoft, for example, if you have Copilot, sort of an enterprise edition or something for businesses, it claims to keep it not used for model tuning in a sort of segmented area. Now, don't get me wrong, I haven't analysed all of DeepSeek's policy down to the fine grain, but let's just assume for a minute they've said the same thing. Let's say they're talking a great talk and they actually are doing all this stuff. If they're bad at cybersecurity, and I don't want to get sued here because maybe they're not that bad, but when we start seeing incidents like exposed databases, or at least data stores in some way, shape or form, we then have to ask that other question about, well, it's great that they segment all the data, maybe they are doing that, but actually if they've got weak security controls, it's going to be exposed anyway. Therefore,
and I guess from when we look at Microsoft, we're assuming as well, because of the underpinnings and legislation that exist in the countries that they're headquartered in and whatnot, that there's something there that regulates as well that data use. So there's a system in place to ensure that not just Microsoft are doing it properly, but there's a system there and I'm guessing here, or picking up on, that one of the concerns is that potentially if this is headquartered in China, that some of the regulatory aspects potentially aren't there around DeepSeek, as you might expect from a Microsoft or a Google, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the funny thing about that is so GDPR obviously is an EU regulation, and I think the reason GDPR works is because of the scope. It's all about the citizens that are resided within EU/UK in our case, right? Now, technically speaking, China would have to comply with GDPR if they wanted to process and be in compliance with GDPR. So there's nothing that says the US has to do this stuff, because outside of state-based legislation, such as California have some quite strict data protection laws, but outside of those individual states that are a bit stronger, most of the US actually has quite weak data protection controls compared to GDPR. But because they are processing EU citizen data, they have to follow GDPR. Now, the risk, of course, and the big difference between the US and China, I think, is the punishment for China if they don't follow GDPR is probably less of a concern to them than what.
Yeah, understood. Understood. So one of the things, just to sort of wrap up the last sort of few points, is one of the things we spoke about actually before we sort of came on the mini podcast that we're doing, was about supply chain trust, and AI is already difficult to deal with in the supply chain. And one of the things I'm also interested in us teasing out quickly is is, we know in the public sector sometimes that the rules can be quite slow to catch up with technology. So, so two questions really for you. What does the supply chain trust and DeepSeek mean for increasing sort of difficulties with supply chain management in the public sector? And secondly, if we do assume that there's a bit of a lag for sometimes the sort of regulation in the public sector to catch up with technology, what can be done in the interim potentially to sort of aid public sector potentially with some of the issues that we've discussed here in the interim?
Yeah, no, that's good questions. So I think on supply chain, I think it's fair to say supply chain and due diligence is always tricky. And that is because if we look at the way that we think this is going to be used, so there's a few different models that DeepSeek kind of operate in, and operate at the moment, and likely will operate in. So first of all, we've got the good old classic, which is what's made the news most recently, the ability to download a mobile app and basically chat with it. Now that is the hosted system. So in other words, it is the concerns we talked about all apply to that. So when I type something into that prompt within the app, it's going to be processed in China and all the stuff we talked about. So that right there is quite easy to do due diligence on, because they will publish, even if they haven't yet, I'm not sure, but if they have, if they haven't, they probably will soon. They will publish where the data is, etc., etc. And government would look at that and likely say that's not acceptable. We're not going to take that risk effectively, and that's quite simple. I think the two other scenarios that we've got to see and what supply chain need to be considerate of is already Azure have offered or started to offer the ability to run their models, as in the DeepSeek models, within Azure or Azure, if there are American, if we've got any American people listening. So ultimately, that is a bit of a medium ground, in my opinion, and one that's a little bit more complex, because the model itself is open source, or the sort of code behind it is open source, effectively, and the ability to do it. So there is some question marks around the process of the supply chain. We have to review that, because what we find in public sector is there's not necessarily the skill set to do those kind of level of review. So we're going to have to, at that point, start to accept the risk going up. Now, because it's hosted on potentially EU infrastructure in Azure, a lot of those risks go away. So this gets a bit more complex. But the point I'm getting at is there is almost these different models forming. And the third one, which I think actually I'd like to talk a bit more about, because I think this is probably the most relevant to public sector and actually private sector as well, is how other companies consume DeepSeek technology. So it's quite hard to avoid nowadays. Any sort of business software as a service solution, everything has got AI buzzword written all over it. Everywhere you go, we use AI, we use this, and blah, blah, blah. Behind the scenes, what a lot of this is doing is using these engines that have been created by people like OpenAI, like DeepSeek, etc. Now, some companies, and potentially the larger organizations, so for example, just use Meta as an example, they have their own AI. So when you communicate with Facebook and it uses AI, that's their own technology. It's all in-house effectively. But smaller software companies are now having to adapt these technologies into their existing tool sets, and they are doing that by consuming these libraries. So effectively, OpenAI libraries, DeepSeek libraries, effectively. Now, they can do that in a few different ways, and I won't bore you with details, but effectively they can embed this stuff within their applications. Now, the problem from a due diligence perspective is it's really hard to understand how that's been done. So to you as an end user, or potentially the one doing that review for public sector ABC, you don't necessarily know whether that data is going to China, to Germany data center, to anywhere. You don't know whether it's a bespoke instance that that particular software provider has created. Now, some customers, some software providers, will be quite open and transparent about this, and I think that's great that they should say this. So we are using OpenAI technology, and it's hosted in the US, for example. I think the risk is, as we start to make it more, back to my first point I made about the price coming down, we're going to start to see this in more and more apps from companies that maybe aren't as good at cybersecurity. So it just becomes an extra risk. And with supply chain due diligence, you're going to ask, potentially going to ask them a question, right? So for example, do you make use of AI? And the smaller companies are going to say yes, and potentially they're going to say yes, we use OpenAI, or yes, we use DeepSeek. The problem at that point is that's not necessarily enough information to allow an organization to make a sensible decision on risk, because you don't have all the information. And in my experience, a lot of these suppliers themselves won't necessarily understand some of the nuances around this. So it's not the fact that they're being deliberately avoiding answering the question, if you will, but it's more about the fact that they don't understand it. So they've probably just consumed an API. They've ultimately just gone and said, oh yeah, send data to here, and then get a response back in the response, and jobs are good. That doesn't necessarily have all the information that's necessary for So those government organisations or public sector
Understood.
organisations decide.
Yeah, understood. So, and this is a problem that we come across quite a lot, isn't it? About the, developers and what not necessarily always wanting to be slowed down by security concerns and the rush to get things to market and the need for secure by design principles to be embedded all the way through. So what you're saying is that actually DeepSeek could potentially just be the first of a number of cheaper models, and actually it could almost be at the lead of a tidal wave of further cheaper AI models that then become embedded in other apps and makes the supply chain even more difficult to sort of understand and manage, and therefore increases the threat over time. Is that right? Sort of summarize?
Absolutely. And in fact, just literally yesterday, I was reading an article about how Apple, so Apple, let's go for a bit of time for a second, if I may.
No, go
Apple
ahead.
have been considered quite slow to adopt AI. Now, obviously, with the release of its latest operating system, so iOS 18 on phones, for example, they've finally kind of caught up, if you will. But they had a relationship with OpenAI, and a lot of people actually criticised this quite publicly. But there is now, the article I read yesterday was quite interesting because it was about how Apple may have saved billions or tens of billions of pounds by being slow. Because what this now means is they can absolutely, just as you were saying, Andy, they can basically adopt this technology because it is an open source piece of code. Theoretically, companies like Apple could come along, take the code, bring it along, spin their own up, create their own AI, which is fantastic, by the way. I think, and Apple will no doubt apply, rigorous security controls. The risk is that's Apple that are really quite privacy focused, etc. Other companies may not be so privacy focused. So yeah, some organizations may not be so privacy focused, and there will be a concern about they're using code that in itself is not going to be sending the data to China. And let's assume for a minute we're not going to go down that whole rabbit hole of backdoors, etc., because that's a whole other conversation. But potentially other companies may adopt this and do bad practices themselves. So it may not even be the fact that it's Chinese is the issue. It's, as you're, I think, alluding to, Andy, that if it becomes more accessible, more companies are going to go and sit there, set this technology up, potentially not understand how to do that securely. And again, it's just that same issue. This data then ends up leaking or, ending up in places not supposed to end up. So yeah, I think overall, it's just broadening the overall, back to your question about supply chain, right? Fundamentally, I think the more organizations have access to AI can be very powerful, it can be very useful, but it's more people that have to do a great job with security, which is always a challenge because you balance that against the cost of doing business, the commercial things, etc. So.
Absolutely, and it's that almost as well. Do you think the understanding is out there on how these large language models actually work? I mean, essentially, they are Uber librarians, aren't they? And actually, they're designed to draw connections between different pieces of information. So actually, the more AI that we have and the more information we feed into them, and even across, let's say, across the public sector in the UK, a little bit of information here, a little bit of information there, even from different departments, for instance, you're feeding this Uber librarian with these different pieces of information. It's designed to draw connections between them almost. So it's almost like giving the information to a fantastic intelligence analyst, and they don't even have to do the work really to go and get it. Would that be sort of right to say?
Yeah, and I think it is. And I think what we're starting to see is, so this obviously all of this LLM stuff has come around because of ChatGPT. Fundamentally, everyone loved the fact that they basically had a sort of search engine on steroids. That's what started off this boom, if you will. And it's great, and it is a fantastic technology. But I think what we're now starting to see, and I think this is what you're talking about, Andy, is the other uses of it. So, for example, Tesla rewrote their software. They previously were trying to do it as like a rules-based engine for autopilot and for full self-driving. So in other words, if it's going down a road and it sees a car and it knows by working out that it's going to potentially hit that car, it would make a decision. And that decision was effectively like coded as a logic algorithm that says, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, whatever. What their new way of doing things is using the same sort of technologies as AI, which is it basically looks at what 100 other people would do in that situation, which is what an LLM is basically doing. It's using all of that data out there and saying, I'm able to, in this scenario, if I'm writing this sentence, 100 other people will have wrote this or responded with this or done this. It's the same principle. Now, that idea of using mass data sets to decide the best outcome, which is starting to tread away from LLMs, but fundamentally that's more about what AI is. we're starting to see more and more use cases. So the most commonplace, of course, now is built into business apps, right? So like I said, if you go into like a CRM system, it will automatically give you a summarized version, or it'll do something. It's all about reading that data and doing something with that text. What I think we're starting to see more and more is those use cases being expanded upon. So a lot of government departments are in the middle of trials about this kind of technology. And I think that's where the risks get bigger, in my opinion. Obviously, just to use my Tesla example, fundamentally, you're not just going to have a humorous response of when it comes back and says something silly. Instead, the car's just going to drive off down the road and crash into something because things. Now, obviously, there's lots of safeguards and all those controls, etc. But as we see more and more moving away from just being a chat interface, which is what we're kind of seeing right now, and more into actually making decisions that impact potentially physical things, I think this becomes a whole lot more interesting.
Okay, well, I think we should wrap it up there. Hopefully, our listeners will find this interesting at the very least. This is the first one of these that we've done, but I hope we do a few more as things come up. So, Anthony, thanks for your time today. And for everybody out there, you've been listening to the Cyber Headspace with Anthony Lloyd and Andy Pyne. And we will speak to you again soon.